My name is Katie Schottler. Thanks for joining this portion of the presentation. A little bit of background about me. Before joining Foley, I worked for Senator Steve Daines from Montana for over 4 years. I was his communications director and senior advisor. Senator Daines currently serves on the Senate Finance Committee, which has jurisdiction over international trade and taxes. So very relevant to the discussion we're having today. Before Daines' office, I worked in the House on the Natural Resources Committee under then Chairman Rob Bishop from Utah. And before that, I started my career in local and state politics in Florida. A little bit of background about our lobbying team at Foley. We're a bipartisan team, and we're made up of former members of Congress and senior congressional staff. And collectively, we have the ability to reach nearly all members of Congress, committees, and key administration officials. We consider ourselves a boutique lobbying shop with the benefits and resources of being part of a large nationwide law firm. We've been able to help clients navigate the intricate tariff environment under the Trump administration. Doing so, we've helped clients develop important relationships with members of Congress and their staff, as well as relationships within the Trump administration. We also serve as the eyes and ears for our clients in Washington, providing real-time updates of relevant and important policy developments at the federal level that impact business, something that's very important as the tariff environment is constantly changing. Not all lobby shops not all law firms have lobby shops, and our team has become an invaluable tool for many of the lawyers handling tariffs and trade issues for clients. We're able to partner together on tariff matters, advocating for the position of our clients with the administration and Congress. I wanted to first start off with this slide. I had this slide up from a webinar I participated in last November, shortly after the presidential election. During that discussion, I emphasized the need for businesses and industry to prepare for significant tariffs. At the time, I also spoke with colleagues from various firms and folks on Capitol Hill and friends in DC, and we were talking about tariffs, and many were skeptical about the likelihood of such developments, and look where we're at now. I think it's important to remember that Trump campaigned on a platform centered around tariffs, and this was a fundamental aspect of his agenda. So, while a lot of folks have frustrations, I don't think this is anything that we shouldn't have been prepared for. So given the ever-changing landscape of tariffs, what should businesses be doing right now? And is it too late to make an impact? The answer is it's never too late, especially as we continue to see the administration make adjustments in various areas. Right now, your business should be meeting with the Trump administration and Congress to advocate for your company's position, whether that's advocating for an exclusions process, a new HTS code, a carve-out, and an upcoming 232 report. Right now is the time to be meeting with folks in the administration and in Congress. So who should you be meeting with? In the administration, of course, you should be talking with the White House, the Department of Commerce, USTR, and Treasury. A lot of folks, haven't been to DC or haven't been part of, the lobbying world up here. And so the question is how. The saying, it's all about who you know, especially rings true in federal lobbying work. Washington, D.C.-based lobbying shop, including ours, can help you set up these meetings. Since we're a bipartisan team, we're able to help clients regardless of which party is in the White House and in Congress. My colleague John Strom and I are the Republican lobbyists on our team, and we both have very good relationships in the administration and in Congress. In fact, John on our team worked under the Trump administration, Trump 1.0, and he was on the transition team for the HHS agency. My old boss, Senator Daines, was the chair of the NRSC committee, so he helped flip the Senate Republican this last campaign cycle, and he has a very close relationship within the Trump administration. So what's your message when you're meeting with the administration? Of course, it really depends on what specific tariff or concerns with tariffs your company has. For many businesses, it's about advocating for an exclusions process for specific products. And I'll touch on the exclusions process in just a moment. But for some, it's the opposite. And I think Greg touched on this during his presentation. For example, when it comes to steel, if your company's product was excluded in Trump 1.0 tariffs, and you've experienced foreign competitors selling at extremely aggressive prices and customers benefiting from buying cheaper imports, it's important to share these data points with the administration. The entire purpose of these tariffs for President Trump himself and the administration is to support U.S. manufacturing jobs. So it's really important to bring these stories and these data points to the administration. There will be a process to advocate for the inclusion of certain HGS codes. And if and when you submit a petition, even before right now, you should be lobbying the administration on it. If your company has submitted public comments to a 232 report, you should be meeting with the administration to advocate for your position. And you could also be able to point to the comments. I work with the client. Obviously, I'm not going to name names or the industry or products, but they submitted comments to a 232 report. And when we were meeting with Commerce and when I was setting up the meeting, talking with my colleague in that agency, he actually asked, did the company already submit public comments? If you haven't done that, it's not the end of the world. You should still be meeting with the administration and sharing your story and sharing these data points. But, if you have, it's, a tool that we can point to during these meetings. On exclusions, when President Trump initially started rolling out tariffs, he and his administration took a very hostile view to an exclusions process across the board. Over time and with lobbying efforts and just looking at the markets, we've seen Trump's position soften. Just yesterday, Trump announced relief for the auto industry, which I know Vanessa is going to be presenting in just a little bit, so she may touch on that. The more the Trump administration hears about the need for an exclusions process, for example, if a product is not available in the United States, the greater the chance we'll see an exclusions process. With exclusions, it's a perfect example of where and how you can leverage congressional influence and congressional support. As a former congressional staffer, I think it's incredibly important for businesses to have relationships with members of Congress and staff that represent their location, also with key committees of jurisdiction, irrespective of the current tariff landscape. Establishing and maintaining these relationships can greatly enhance advocacy efforts and ensure that the interests of local businesses or industry are effectively communicated and considered in legislative discussions. Sometimes we'll have members of Congress call up and their staff call up some of our clients and say, what concerns do you guys have on tariffs? Also working with, clients, you can have members of Congress come tour your facility and do a site visit and really hear one-on-one and have, boots on the ground to talk about the impacts of these tariffs. When it comes to tariffs, members of Congress can help influence the administration and can help businesses advocate for their position through several channels. Let me just get to the next slide. Whether that's writing a letter of support for a Section 232 carve-out, formally or informally advocating for an exclusions process, helping setting up meetings and more. Over the last few weeks, we've seen more and more Republican lawmakers carefully, but voice their public concerns with tariffs, while of course still showing support for the president and the administration. USTR Greer was at the Senate and House just a couple of weeks ago. I was actually on the Hill with a manufacturing client at the time. And, we saw folks like Senator Tillis and Senator Johnson from Wisconsin, both Republicans in the Senate, share concerns with tariffs, and almost all mentioned something about the need for an exclusions process. And I think we're going to continue to see an uptick in that. So there's a lot of opportunities right now to be advocating and meeting with folks in the administration and in Congress. In closing, I just want to reiterate that it's not too late to advocate and lobby for your business or industry. And if you guys have any questions or want to connect on a possible engagement, please don't hesitate to reach out. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Kate and Vanessa.
Thank you. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Kate Wagrin. I am a partner in our Milwaukee office and chair of our supply chain team. Until a couple weeks ago, my job was primarily negotiating and advising on supply chain agreements for clients. So supply agreements, distributor agreements, logistics agreements, and the like. Now my job is tariffs. And this is what I talk about all day. So in terms of coping mechanisms, one, of course, is what Katie just talked about, lobbying for some kind of an exception. The other is to take a look at your contracts and see what they say about your position on whether or not you have to bear the responsibility for tariffs. In talking about this, I want to start with force majeure and commercial impracticability. They are defenses to performance under contracts. The reason that we're starting here is not because these are good tools for tariffs. In fact, they are not, as you'll hear, but I'm seeing a lot of sort of hastily drafted blog posts from law firms and the like that have some misinformation on the utility of these defenses as it relates to tariffs. So kind of want to walk through the case law a little bit and show why these are probably not the answer that that we might hope they'd be. So again, force majeure and commercial impracticability are two different defenses to having to perform under a contract that you've entered into. So you have these supply agreements that you are supposed to be purchasing under and selling under, and now you're potentially upside down on your entire cost structure. Can you invoke your force majeure provision or the default rule of commercial impracticability to get out of performance? So what these two are, it's important to note, first of all, that neither of these doctrines are meant to be mechanisms for obtaining price increases. They are supposed to apply when your performance is actually prevented, so that it's essentially like a timeout in performance, not that you can then charge more for performance. Force majeure, one of those two defenses to performance, is a contractual provision. So first step is you need to take a look at what the contract says. If it says something about tariffs and not that performance is prevented, but that performance is made more expensive, and it says that you can increase prices, then maybe that is a potential avenue to explore. Most of them are not drafted like that. Most of them say things like acts of God. As Greg mentioned in presentation 1, it's a hurricane taking out your building, not Hurricane Trump making your price structure upside down. I thought I liked that and plan to use that. So some of these, though, do have broad language at the end about any other circumstance beyond a party's reasonable control. That can be helpful in negotiations. So bringing it to the table of your counterparty and saying, hey, like, we need to talk about this. I can't bear all of this. Let's negotiate an avenue for both of us to share the cost and impact of these tariffs. But in a court of law, it still probably is not going to help you. And we can get to that. Again, important to look at them because they are contractual provisions. So if your contract says something different, it could be helpful. But all in all, the case law has not been positive in this area, which we'll see on the next few slides. First, though, commercial impracticability, that is a default rule under Article 2 of the Uniform Commercial Code. So where force majeure is something you've written into the contract, this is something that you have if you're in a sale of goods context as a matter of law. This is 2615. Article 2 of the Uniform Commercial Code governs the sale of goods in all 50 states except for Louisiana. And this provision, 2615, essentially says that if an event occurs, the non-occurrence of which was a basic assumption that both parties had when they entered into it, then you can be excused from performance if your performance was made impracticable by the occurrence of that event that both parties assumed would not occur. Unlike impossibility, which is a common law construct, impracticability doesn't actually require that it's impossible to perform, just that it is commercially impracticable, which may sound to a lawyer's ear like, well, this has become commercially unreasonable to perform because costs have gone up so high. The actual official comments of UCC 2615 say increased costs alone are not enough. And that bears out in case law. Courts don't like to let parties out of their contractual obligations, and they view these increases in costs as the reason that a buyer might enter into a fixed price contract, is to navigate future potential price increase, cost increase. So they don't look at these defenses as mechanisms to get out of your commercial contracts, which you'll see again borne out in the case law. So some key takeaways from case law. Courts are consistently rejecting arguments that tariff-related price increases can justify non-performance under these doctrines of force majeure and commercial impracticability. They see these as foreseeable risks that parties assume when they entered into them. Since 2010, 2018, we haven't seen a single case based on tariff levels successfully invoke these doctrines to excuse their performance. The price increases alone rarely constitute commercial impracticability. Again, that's built into the official comments. There's an exception in that case. It was a 572% cost increase, and the buyer received an unjustified windfall. The court did entertain the commercial impracticability argument in that case. So one case that is an exception. And again, they're typically ruling that even extreme financial hardship due to increases in costs are not enough to excuse performance. Here's a little chart. I'm not going to go through it in great detail. What I just want you to see is sort of the denied a commercial impracticability claim again and again. 86% increases in cost, 42, 32, 30%, 15%, 40%, 45%, 135% did not establish commercial impracticability. 40%, 61 and 67%. These are not really viable avenues for relief, unfortunately, for the tariffs that we're seeing right now. And even government actions are not usually enough to trigger a force majeure. So the Suez Canal closed, that was not enough to excuse performance. COVID-19 related steel price hikes was not enough to excuse performance. Compliance with EPA regs, significant compliance cost increases was not enough to excuse performance. This one is particularly interesting. U.S. sanctions block payments to a particular person, and that was not ruled, making the debt repayment objectively impossible. So it's a really high bar, and these probably aren't avenues that are going to be successful except in a negotiation process, which is still worthwhile and can still have a lot of merit. Okay, so those are not likely successful avenues. What is the right place to look in a contract to see what your contract says about your responsibility for bearing the cost of tariffs? Really, the best place is price, which we'll get to in the next slide, but there could be other areas of the contract that come up. In the construction industry, there's sometimes of a change of law provision that says if law changes and cost structure gets haywire, then we can get together and see who bears the increase of that, revisit the pricing structure at that time. The clause like that could be helpful to help the negotiation process. A hardship clause, which says that if one party has extreme economic hardship, they can terminate the contract. This has, though, unless it's really, really carefully drafted, it has a lot of subjectivity into it and could have a lot of room for dispute. So not the most useful place. Again, the best bet you have is in your pricing structure. Hopefully you have it tied to some kind of index or has some flexibility for increased cost in it. If, however, you're a seller with a fixed price contract that has no such flexibility and no other provision addresses it, like we'll talk about in the next couple of bullets, imposing a surcharge is technically a breach of contract. Now, people have done it and are doing it, but technically that is a breach of contract. The tax provision is another important area to look at, because the tariff, of course, as we all know now, is a tax on the U.S. importer of record. So what does your tax provision say? Now, important to recognize here that a tax provision, so if you're a U.S. entity and you're selling to a U.S. company, the tax provisions are typically drafted to account for the taxes between those two parties as it relates to that sale. They're not usually contemplating the taxes imposed on components of the product further down the supply chain that you incur before you even are selling it to your buyer. So important to look at, because it's a tax and maybe it's drafted broadly enough to give you some cover, but typically that is the way these tax provisions are drafted. Another key area to look at are the delivery terms. So Incoterms are not rule of law, but they are essentially a commercial agreement that everyone agrees what these terms have meant. They're in a little book. Incoterms 2020 is what we're on. they have an agreed set of principles behind each of the terms. So Ex Work, for example, is a very seller-friendly term, and it imposes the cost of tariffs and duties on the buyer. DDP, a very buyer-friendly term, imposes the cost of duties and tariffs on the seller. Now, again, these are not rule of law, so they can be modified by contract. So even if your contract says one of these, and there are other Incoterms as well, if it says an Incoterm, you still need to make sure that that wasn't modified by some other portion of the contract, which is, fully allowed. So just seeing Ex Works and DDP is not the end of the analysis, but it's certainly a helpful component.
Well, it certainly has been a challenging time, an ongoing challenging time, I think, for auto. I'm Vanessa Miller. I'm head of Foley's National Auto Team and represent a number of suppliers and emerging OEMs in these issues. I do a lot of litigation in the automotive industry, but I also do a lot of commercial contract counseling by virtue of seeing how inefficient it is to litigate against your key customer or your strategic supplier. Getting in front of these things at the contracting side is critical. So I'm going to follow on a lot of what Kate just talked about with respect to what are we seeing? How are we seeing, or how do we expect to see these disputes play out? Because companies have repeatedly said that these tariffs were not contemplated in their contracting. So how are we going to allocate these costs between the parties? And we know that, I'll just use the automotive industry as an example, to the extent that a supplier is successful in passing through 100% of the tariff costs, 100% of those costs to their customer, that customer is probably going to want to be looking to switch suppliers very quickly. It's not like flipping a light switch. It's going to take time. However, there will be a desire to shift away to a lower cost supplier so that it's cost effective for the customer. And in the automotive industry, you typically have the right to terminate for convenience at any time with a certain notice period. So companies that are going to be impacted by this from their direct suppliers or from their suppliers' sub-suppliers will be looking to move away if the supplier is insistent that the tariffs must be passed through 100%. Now, from the supplier side, they're in a very difficult situation because the suppliers cannot absorb these tariffs. And if the customer continues to insist, these are fixed price contracts for the life of the part, life of the program, you signed up to this, and we're not going to agree to a price increase at this time. You'll have to wait until the end of the program. Well, you better believe that that supplier is going to be looking for any way possible to get out of that contract, and that it's not going to be sustainable for the supplier either. So this is the tug of war that exists right now in this environment. And what are we seeing? First, we are seeing some business to business discussions. We're seeing some commercial discussions where the parties are sitting down and trying to figure out what is viable. What can we do? How can we shift certain capacity and production around so that we're not as impacted by these tariffs? Some companies are actually going back to the price discussion table and figuring out what the new fair price would be. Because at the end of the day, the only party that is able to pass these price increases on to the consumers, which we know is typically how tariffs play out, prices will go up on products. The only company that's able to do that is the one at the top of the supply chain, selling direct to consumers. So for example, in automotive, the OEMs are the ones that will have to increase vehicle prices. We are also seeing some companies that are kind of living to fight another day about who's responsible for the tariffs. They are saying, we will pay under protest this price increase. We need to keep the product coming in. So we're going to pay the higher price. We're going to cover the tariffs or the tariff surcharge under protest, but we're reserving our rights. And Kate mentioned that may be a breach to just charge a surcharge and expect that to be pushed through. And we're seeing companies say, we'll see. we don't know what we're going to do right now. We're assessing. We may come after you for that. We may declare that you in breach for charging us that, or that just may be the new normal. The surcharge is included. And then we are seeing more aggressive tactics that are happening. And we saw this with the inflationary pressures after COVID, when the fixed prices really didn't make sense anymore, given labor increases, freight increases, raw material increases, et cetera. So we saw this technique where a supplier would threaten to stop ship or actually stop shipping product to the customer and say, we will not ship you any more product unless we can reach a pricing agreement. And I call that the nuclear option, because it really, it's a technique that it's not favorable in the supply chain. And of course, it is very difficult on both the customer and the supplier to escalate something to that point. But we are seeing that in some situations, the procurement group of the buyer is not even authorized to discuss price negotiations until something escalates to that point. So we're seeing that. And then finally, we're seeing long-term resourcing decisions. To the extent that these tariffs are going to be in place and they're going to be impacting the parties, we're seeing companies make longer-term decisions, moving away from certain areas, in-housing certain manufacturing processes, and looking at alternate suppliers. And I think we'll continue seeing that as the uncertainty plays out across the supply chain. So with respect to the pricing disputes, to the extent a supplier does stop shipping, you may see the buyer rush to court. The buyer may rush to court seeking an injunction. And that injunction is an extraordinary remedy that is something besides money. You're asking the court not to award money, but to prevent some harm or to require some performance, which is typically not what the courts like to do. They don't like to get involved in day-to-day business. So you're asking the court for extraordinary relief. And there are 4 elements to establish or to prevail on a preliminary injunction or a TRO. That is 1, likelihood of success on the merits. Basically, which party is going to win, which party is right under the contract. 2, irreparable harm. Is this something that is truly more than about money? Is this something that cannot be remedied through an award of money later? 3rd is balancing of the harms. Which party is more likely to be harmed? The buyer, if we don't provide the injunction, or the seller, if we do and require the seller to keep shipping? And then 4 is public policy or public interest. Now, I will tell you that in my experience, I've handled dozens of these, and I expect that there will be more in the coming months. My experience is that courts, judges will typically sway all 4 factors in favor of the party that they think should prevail. And that's because this is an equitable remedy. So the court really is going to look at which party is in the right here, and which party should prevail on this, at least such that we're requiring the supplier to keep shipping, or we're telling the buyer, no, the supplier does not need to keep shipping. They're not obligated to do so. The first 2 elements are the most critical. Who's right under the contract? Who's going to win? And is this about more than just money? So in the buyer's view, when you're talking about tariffs and you're talking about price increases, oftentimes clients will say, well, of course, it's just about money. We're just asking for more money. They can pay it. And then we'll keep shipping our product. Well, what the buyer will say from the buyer side is, this is going to cause a major disruption. It's going to interrupt my continuity of supply, going to have lines go down. I'm going to have to lay off workers, going to have reputational damage to me and loss of goodwill from customers if I shut down my assembly lines because I can't get product from the seller. And the seller is going to say, well, the remedy here is that the buyer just has to increase their prices, and then we will ship. And the buyer can even do it under protest. They can reserve their rights, do it under protest. And then if we're wrong and we were not entitled to those price increases, those additional price hikes due to the tariffs, then down the road, the buyer can sue us for a regular breach of contract and recover. How we've seen this play out in courts is it really depends. It depends not only on what jurisdiction you're in, whether you're in state or federal court, and which particular judge you appear before. But there's also trends that we're even seeing with judges where they'll take a view one day that it is irreparable harm and a view the next that the buyer didn't meet that difficult standard. In the automotive industry, we're seeing this play out significantly with respect to whether or not contracts are truly requirements contracts, meaning that the seller is obligated to supply the buyer's requirements for certain components. And there's a huge split, a huge divide in the case law right now that needs to be taken up with the Michigan Supreme Court. So we're waiting to see what happens there. But basically, the bottom line is when the parties are doing well under the contract, when the seller is able to sell to the buyer and is making money on the product, of course the seller wants to sell as much of that product as they can to the buyer. They want to have requirements contracts at a price, an agreed price, and get all of the volumes from that buyer. When the seller is losing money on the product, as is the case with many of these tariff situations, that's when the seller will be looking for mechanisms to get out of the contract and to say, this is not really a binding requirements contract for the life of the part, life of the program. No, this is actually a release by release contract, and we need to start rejecting these releases because it's too expensive for us to perform. So what can we do? What can we do going forward? What have we learned from this? And there are a couple specific ways moving forward that parties can address tariffs in their supply chain contracts now. And this has become a real focal point. I will give you this preview. I do not think that parties are going to expressly say which party is responsible for future tariffs in their contracts, and I'll tell you why. You can, of course, by contract, shift the risk and say the seller is going to absorb all the tariffs, they're the importer of record, or the buyer is going to absorb all the tariffs if there's future tariffs. And the seller can insist on that. The seller can say, if there's future tariffs that we weren't aware of, reciprocal tariffs, retaliatory tariffs, any government action that increases the cost, then we need the buyer to absorb that. Or the buyer can insist the seller absorb that. I think that's going to be a really tough sell for companies in ordinary course supply chain negotiations. From the seller's perspective, how do you put a price on that question mark? How do you make that into a number for your piece price? And won't you just really bid yourself out of the work? Your price for the component will probably be more expensive than your competitor that might not be insisting on that unknown, on that question mark. And I think from the buyer's perspective, they want to live to fight another day. They want the best price from their seller. We don't know what's going to happen, and they need to continue doing business as usual and maintain continuity of supply across their supply chain. So I don't think that we're likely to see future supply chains that expressly state which party is going to bear the question mark of future tariffs across the board, particularly in contracts that are longer than a year, 2 years. I mean, you're talking about some of these contracts in automotive are 10 years plus the unilateral right for the buyer to extend if they decide to keep the program in play longer. You just don't know what's going to happen, and it's too difficult to put a value on that. So what other mechanisms are there that are a little bit more watered down, that are a little bit easier to swallow? And I think that what we're seeing is mandating a tariff-triggered price renegotiation such that the parties come together and work cooperatively to decide that they will work in good faith. Now, we all know how difficult it is to say whether or not a party is acting in good faith in negotiations, but at least having that provision in your contract, even though it's looser, it requires the parties to come to the table and deal with each other fairly. And that's at least a step in the right direction if you have tariff impacts that are impacting both parties. What we are also seeing is sellers being more vigilant about including certain price adjustment rights directly in their quotation, or to the extent they're being asked to provide a updated quotation because of an engineering change notice or because of an annual pricing renewal, The sellers are including language reserving the right to adjust prices to reflect the impact of any tariffs, duties, or government charges that are imposed after the date of the proposal. That just gives the supplier something to point to and say, wait, this was the price then, but with these changes, we need to talk about that price. Really important to keep in mind overall supply chain integrity. I think that this is a theme going through the entire day's presentations. This is an issue for both existing and then new suppliers. We're seeing a major increase in detentions relating to supply chain integrity and a major focus on supply chain issues. So to the extent that companies are making really strategic and really impactful decisions across their supply chain as a result of tariffs and to keep costs down, it's important to do a great job vetting new and secondary suppliers to make sure that you're not stepping into something worse than higher costs with respect to tariffs, that you know who you're starting to deal with from a supply chain contracting side. So engaging in those initial exercises with your potential candidates, supply chain mapping, sub-supplier identification, flow down conditions, really looking closely at Chinese parts and components, including those from your suppliers, sub-suppliers, are going to be important, not just thinking about the direct impact of the tariff costs, but looking deeper than that, because there can be other impacts that will significantly change pricing in your supply chain. With that, I would like to invite Katie and Kate back so we can answer some of these questions that we're seeing come through.
Thanks, Vanessa. We got a question if there's any appetite from Congress to roll back or limit the tariffs. The answer is yes, but it doesn't really matter. So the Senate is actually scheduled to vote tonight, or as early as tonight, on a resolution to terminate the national emergency that President Trump has used to implement his tariffs, across the board tariffs. Senate Republican leaders are, of course, actively working to oppose this measure, and they're whipping against it. And the measure would revoke the president's authority to impose the 10% tariffs on all imported goods and the reciprocal tariffs that he announced earlier this month, and then, of course, subsequently paused for 90 days. There is a possibility that the vote could pass in the Senate, as there's 4 Republicans who previously supported a similar measure regarding earlier tariffs on Canada, and they're expected to back the broader initiative tonight. However, House Republicans don't plan to bring up the resolution for a vote. And regardless, President Trump has already stated that he would veto the resolution if it got to his desk for signature. And there wouldn't be enough votes in the House and the Senate to override the veto. So there is appetite. And like I mentioned earlier, we're seeing more and more Republicans vocally share concerns with tariffs. And we're seeing a handful of Republicans co-sponsoring these types of resolutions. In fact, Senator Grassley, who is known to be an ally of the president, actually co-sponsored a similar resolution. And then, there's Republicans like Senator Murkowski and Senator Collins, who are more moderate, that will most likely vote for the resolution tonight. But again, it doesn't really matter. The House passed this gimmicky rule that they wouldn't be forced to bring this up for a vote. And again, President Trump said he would veto any resolution that got to his desk. So hopefully that answered your question. And Greg, I think you wanted to touch on 232 process.
Yeah. So we also got several questions about the Section 232 process, including about the potential expansion of products that are covered under the sectoral tariffs, and then the general process. So to cover them in order, first, each time there is a new potential sectoral tariff announced, like the truck one was the most recent one, or the semiconductor one, they set up a period for comments, and it is a very quick period. You only get 21 days generally, and that's it. There's not even like a rebuttal period. You can put your comments in, so it's kind of like one shot. And companies will ask us, like, well, does it make sense? Do they pay attention to these items? And usually what we tell people is, look and see whether or not you have something unique to say. If you're going to come in and say, this is going to raise our costs and that's going to hurt us, then the administration already knows about that. But if you have something unique to say, like, we're representative of the industry, or there's a certain type of product that it's important to carve out, or it's important that you don't hit USMCA compliant goods, or there's something unique, point of view you have, or a remedy, then definitely consider putting something in, because the administration is looking at these comments. They are in particular looking at the scope of what's to be covered. So while you might not be able to derail like a general movement to impose a tariff in one of these areas that's being covered, you may be able to impact how it's implemented or the potential scope. The other thing that we tell people is try to look for something that's narrowly tailored. Like, you don't want to say you need to exempt like this entire category of goods that would like blow a hole in the entire tariff structure. But if there's like a narrowly tailored way in which it could be implemented that would further the goals of the administration, which is to foster manufacturing, like here's a critical item that comes in, it's something you can't get in the United States, you'll never be able to get in the United States, but it's something that we really need. And it would hurt a lot of U.S. manufacturing jobs if this were to be included, then that's the kind of like narrowly tailored area where you might be looking at potentially having something that could benefit your company, but not undermine the efficacy of the orders. Like, here's a very narrow 10-digit subheading that should be carved out or something like that. So that's kind of what we're looking at. If you're just going to be putting in like a not generic question, information, if you're going to put in something generic, like this is just going to raise your cost, then probably don't look at it at all. But if you've got something unique, put it in. The second question, we had several questions about the derivative product expansion. We anticipate that this is going to be something that's going to be posted on regulations.gov, where people can put in and say, hey, we think that this additional steel product should be added to the subheadings for the derivative steel products, because for the same reasons, but for the same reasons that other derivative products are covered, this product contains a lot of steel, a lot of aluminum. It's an automotive product that should be added, something like that. Those are going to open up 90 days after each sectoral tariff was rolled out. And we expect that those may be open for a longer period of time. But it's going to be very important. That's like the foundational effort for companies that are looking to potentially expand the tariffs. We don't know if there's going to be a rebuttal opportunity or if that is something that, what the process will be. But we anticipate that it's going to be something similar to how on the flip side, the product exclusions were covered under Section 232 in the first Trump administration and into the Biden administration. The other thing I would add is we have, at least from the first Trump administration, firsthand knowledge that the exclusions process and that the administration looks at things seriously. It's a matter of public record. For example, the Foley International Trade Group was looking for an exemption for electronic cores for transformers and also for medical grade and surgical grade gloves, and that both of those were granted. So that is proof that these things are likely not going into a black hole. The administration is aware that they're painting with a bit of a broad brush, and this is the opportunity to tailor things as well. With that, I want to turn it over to Vanessa to address the Robinson-Patman issue that somebody raised as well, which is very far outside of my skill set.
Thanks, Greg. One question about the Robinson-Patman Act. If the RPA applies to a product, how might the issue of tariffs raise concerns under the RPA? Interesting question, because that act is primarily concerned with pricing discrimination between two competing buyers for the same product and potentially harming competition. And that's enforced by the FTC. So what happens when because of the tariff structure, tariffs are imposed on certain imported goods that necessarily will increase the cost of those goods, but it may disparately impact one buyer over another, depending on whether the seller, for example, might choose to absorb some of the tariff cost for one of its buyers, but not for another. And it might create this sort of potential breeding ground for pricing discrimination that the FTC would focus on. And there's other ways that could play out depending on which of your partners in the supply chain you're reaching different agreements with when the products are coming from the same places. So I think that's going to be very fact specific, and that companies, you're right, this is something that companies should be watching. But the tariffs themselves are a matter of trade policy. So that's not something that the sellers are responsible for. However, how the sellers apply those tariffs and whether they create some situation where certain buyers have an advantage over another because they're getting a better price, that could be a pricing discrimination question. And that could lead to the FTC getting involved and taking action to ensure that the seller is not using the tariffs in a way to create price differences between competing buyers. So it's basically how you use that tool, and making sure, just if you're doing it in an unfair way, that's going to probably get the FTC's attention.
So the only thing I would add there is we actually very recently published an article on antitrust considerations relating to tariffs. That's available on our Tariff and International Trade Resources page. The quick summary is, if you're imposing like a tariff surcharge, or increasing prices, the same considerations to avoiding collusion and things like that apply in that context as well. It doesn't make it, it's not any more legal to coordinate increases in response to tariff concerns than it is to coordinate prices in general. And the full details by people who know more about antitrust law than I do are in the article.